What's up, YouTube? In today's video, we're going to be looking at .NET Core configuration providers, specifically custom configuration providers. So you're probably wondering, what the heck is a configuration provider? Well, if you've been doing .NET for any length of time, you probably know what that means. It's the configuration system in the framework. Now, unlike the .NET framework, the .NET Core framework allows for a lot of extensibility in the configuration system. Out of the box, we get quite a few configuration providers, and I'll explain what they are so you'll get a sense of what that is. So we have a file configuration provider that allows us to access our configuration information from JSON files, XML files, INI files, INI files. If you've been programming from way back, you know what those files are. We have Azure Key Vault. So if you want to have secret data and stuff, you can use Azure Key Vault. There's a configuration provider for Azure Key Vault. There's one for in-memory, there's one for environment variables, there's one for command line arguments, and on and on and on. Out of the box, the .NET framework, or at least Microsoft, provides through a NuGet called Microsoft.extensions.configuration it is. If it's not, that is configurations.extensions. I get confused, but yeah. So Microsoft provides you with about probably 8, 9, 10 configuration providers out of the box. So then why would you want to build one of these things? Well, because you can. No, you shouldn't do something just because you can. What if you have a need for your configuration data to be in a database? What if you have a need to access an external service because there's a bunch of systems in your organization that all have to access their configuration system from the same place, so therefore the data is consistent, if you will. There's many scenarios where you have that case. And so in today's video, we're going to be looking at building a configuration provider, a custom configuration provider that gets its data from a database. Now, the implementation, once you see the implementation, you realize you could build pretty much any data source, if you will, that provides you with that data, right? It's up to your imagination. You can make it go out to a service or do something fancy. The key aspect I'm trying to get across here in this video is that we can build one of these things and we can plug it into the ecosystem, the .NET Core ecosystem, and any application that was previously using the configuration system, let's say app settings.json file, can be swapped out, or with a single one-liner can be modified to use your configuration provider, that is the source of data that you decided to use. And if your implementation is correct, then that application should just work flawlessly. And we're going to do that in this video as well. We're going to start from the beginning and then just take it step by step and go through the whole process, plug it into a pre-existing application and see that application is still working as expected. And then maybe we'll talk about how we won't actually do it today, but we'll talk about how we would test the classes we built today, and see how that would work. And maybe I'll make another video on the test for that class or those classes, right? All right, so let's get started. You ready? All right, then. Look here at the screen. Yeah, over here. You don't see it? There you go. All right. So what I have is the previous project that we built on the using the configuration. Now, unfortunately, the names are complex. See, I've been using configuration provider for years, and Microsoft just decided to use the same name for the .NET Core side. So it used to be called Configuration Manager in .NET Framework, and now we're dealing with configuration providers. It's a naming conflict. I apologize. I'm not necessarily confused myself, but for those of you who are looking at this, might be a bit confused. But I talked about in a couple of videos on using a configuration provider that was giving you that abstraction from the configuration system. In today's video, the configuration provider is really the .NET Framework version of it. It's not the one I've been talking about in the last 2 or 3 videos. However, I do need to reference the code we had there because I want to use that pre-existing application that was using app settings.json. And I want to show you how you could kind of discover what you need to do. And then eventually when we're done with the custom configuration provider in today's video, we'll plug it into this application to see this application function as it was before we started. All right. All right. So there's a few things I want to bring out to your notice or attention. This iConfiguration root, what the heck is that? Right, because that's what we're dealing with over here. After this setup that we do here using the configuration builder, we now have the output or the result of all of that is a configuration root, which is an iConfiguration root. So let's take a look at that class or that interface. Okay, so it looks like it's just a simple collection of iConfigurationProviders. Now, if only things look that simple, what is this iConfigurationProvider here? This looks like a little more interesting. So we have a load method. I'm guessing that's where you sort of initialize your data, your data source, and load up the data from there. And then the set would be allowing you to initialize the data source, and the try get will get you the data given the key, get the value. So that's using the try get design pattern, or the pattern, I guess, not design pattern. Okay, so basically the iConfiguration root is really a collection of iConfiguration providers. So we need to definitely build one of these guys because that's how it's going to plug in there. Go back here. We also have this thing of doing an add. So it says add JSON file, and there's a bunch of other adds, but what is the add itself taking in? Okay, the add is taking an iConfiguration source. So from the configuration builder, anytime you want to add something, it basically you can add anything that implements iConfiguration source. So let's look at iConfiguration source. Who has an iConfiguration source anywhere? iConfiguration root doesn't have no, that's iConfiguration provider. iConfiguration. Okay, that's not it. So we need to find an iConfiguration source. I'm just going to type it in here so we can F12 that. So the iConfiguration source provides us with the builder, and it returns a iConfiguration provider. Okay, this is getting a little complicated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start splitting this up into multiple screens for the ones that I need. So I need the iConfiguration provider as well. Let's pull that up. And then I'm just going to split these into horizontal views. Okay. So we need the add method of the configuration builder takes in an iConfiguration source. So we definitely need one of these guys. This has got a single one method called build that provides us with the builder, but then returns an iConfiguration provider. And oh, okay, that's the iConfiguration provider. That's the same class that we saw earlier. Okay. So we need to implement one of these guys. I'm guessing this is one of the guys that is going to do the work for us, that actually works with our source, because it knows how to load the source, it knows how to set the data in the source, and it knows how to get the value. So we need to implement something that implements this interface. And in order to be able to add that to the configuration system in our application, we need one of these guys that implements this build, that has a build method, and this returns an instance of one of these guys. And then that iConfiguration root is nothing but a collection of these guys, right? So I hope that makes sense. I'm going a little fast, but you can, I don't know, slow down the video or watch it again. It's new, so yeah, I get it. All right. So if we look at our, let me take this out now. Right. So in order to do the add here, we need to be able to have a iConfiguration source, something that implements iConfiguration source. And then the iConfiguration source is returning when something calls the build method, it returns an instance of iConfigurationProvider, which is really the custom configuration provider that we are trying to build in the first place. How simple is that? Yeah, in hindsight, everything is simple. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new folder to this. Am I in the right solution here? Yes. All right. So in this project, I'm going to add a new folder. Call it custom configuration source. And in here, I'm going to add a new class, call it database configuration source. And I'm going to just cut out the namespaces here. I think the namespace actually is different, isn't it? It's .NET Provider, .NET Core. So I'll just use the same namespace. Right. And then with this class, need to add these using clauses. Right. All right. So we have a class that implements the iConfiguration source. Something or someone is going to call this build method on it. And at the time, we need to return an iConfigurationProvider. We don't have one of those yet, so I can't actually implement this thing here. And what I've decided is that I want to be given the database connection string as an argument. And then from that point forward, we can go. That way you have you can choose your own database, and the database, the server, and the database itself. But in the database, the schema for the table that's required is, of course, going to be specific to our requirements. So even though you could configure, if you will, which database to use and which database, like server, if you will, to use and what database to use, once you're in the database, we do expect a table by a specific name to exist, and that table must have a specific schema. I think that's not too much to ask, is it? All right. I think we can work with that. Okay, so now we need a class that implements iConfigurationProvider. So back in the same folder, we'll have a database ConfigurationProvider class. Database ConfigurationProvider. Do you guys do this sometimes? I always seem to have this capital R when I do provider. All right. You do that and fix up this namespace again. I do normally have classes in a certain folder take on that additional namespace, but in these small projects, I just don't like a whole clutter of namespaces, all within the same project with 1 and 2 classes in there. So I'm just taking the namespaces out here. And plus the namespace, I think, as you can see from the original thing, their namespace is this, whereas it's adding in the with test part, since this was modified from that previous project. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it doesn't really matter. All right, then again, with the help of some magic, we can add in a bunch of implementation here. All right, and we need to add the using clause. I'll briefly explain this. This class is nothing really specific. It's nothing, fancy or special. It's database stuff. So if you're not familiar with AD.NET, ADO.NET, then you might find this code alien. If you are you familiar with, it's actually first thing in the morning. I haven't had my coffee. Actually, I've had a couple of coffees. Okay. So it's not the coffee then. Maybe something else. Maybe I'm just losing my mind. If you've worked with AD.NET before, then you'll find this code pretty normal. So I'm going to go with that assumption because the aim is not to explain AD.NET here, but it's simple database or normal, let's say not simple, normal database stuff. All right. So this class is the real custom provider. And it doesn't like that because, there's a naming conflict. Shoot. Yes. This naming conflict is going to kill us. All right. So we'll say this is coming from Microsoft.extensions.configuration, right, that. Okay. I'm going to give Microsoft second place because I was already there first. I've been using ConfigurationProviders since, I don't know, I think like 2000 or maybe even earlier than that. Yeah, no, way earlier than that too. All right. So they're late to the party, so they lose out. I get to use ConfigurationProvider myself. Okay. Now, so I get a connection string. Using that connection string, we create a SQL Server DB connection. And then whoever calls the load method, we don't really know who's calling the load method, but when they do call the load method, our aim is to go get the data from our source. And I didn't explain this part here. This ConfigurationProvider, this is a built-in class. It's not, by built-in, I mean it's available to us in the .NET framework or in these extensions, NuGet. And it's done a bunch of implementation already. So that's what that class looks like. So it's implementing this iConfigurationProvider, but we have a class there. It's doing all of the stuff here. And it turns out that it has a data member which is protected, which means we can have access to it as a descendant, which we are. And it's really nothing but a dictionary of string. Right? So it's doing all that for us. In other words, it's caching. If you were to go to a database to load your data source, your configuration source from that database, you make one trip to the database, but then when you come back and you implement the load method, this data class has all of that data in there. And from that point forward, you're not going to a database over and over again. So I think that's a really cool thing. Which means if you were going to a remote service, it's the same idea. If I were to use Azure Table Storage, to get my data from there, or Azure Key Vault, or Azure Cosmos DB, it's a one-time trip to the database. And then you don't keep going back. If you implement this correctly, you don't keep going back to the database. Now, it has this, the ability to kind of detect modifications and reload the data. And I think it's most applicable to like the file versions of the configuration providers. Like you have the JSON file, an XML file, and any file where they can use the operating system's feature to notify you when the file changes, and you can detect that change, and then you can react and reload the data, right? So from a database standpoint, there's no automatic thing. You'll have to implement that, but that's not the point of this discussion. So anyway, we're going to derive from this class. So we get all of the implementation for free, but we have to implement the load. We probably also implement the set. And the try get, of course, is standard. Since it's using a dictionary, we don't have to implement this ourselves, but we don't need the on reload anyways. So we have our database configuration provider that descends from configuration root. All right. In the load method, as I said earlier, just a few seconds ago, I mean, like wasn't that long ago, we load up our data from our data source. So of course, the assumption is the connection will open, which means you've given it the right connection string. And of course, there's a certain table name that we're expecting called configuration. And the table has a certain schema. It's got these three fields: section, key, and value. If you don't know what these things mean in an app settings JSON file, or typically any configuration systems, there's the notion of a section. That's the section. This is just JSON, but this is considered the section. And then that's the key, and then that's the value. So sort of three parts to it. So our database provider has a table that has three columns in it: the section, the key, and the value. And of course, if you understand data modeling, you can see that the section and the key combination has to be unique. You can build that into the database. I personally like to do that, but yeah, that's a different story. We'll actually be building the database too in this case, or defining the database and the schema. So we'll take a little round trip a little trip off to database line and come back here to C#, but I will just explain this to you. So we select all the data from this table as these three fields. And of course, the assumption is it's all going to go okay. As you know, I don't do any error handling or exception handling scenario. If it blows up, it's your problem. I mean, seriously, if you can't give me a connection string that's going to work, you think I'm going to worry about it? No, not my problem. That's your problem. Buyer beware, as I say. Caveat emptor. All right. And then we iterate over the records we receive. And for every record we receive, we concatenate as the key of the dictionary, the section, colon, as you can see here, colon. So that's the colon. So this part is the section. Field 0 is section. Then this is the key. So the key part is the key part of the dictionary is the combination of section, colon, key. And then the value is, of course, the value. That's the third column here. Normal ADO.NET stuff. And all goes well, cool, right? It's done. It's loaded up. It's added it to this data member. That is, it has inherited from the pre-existing class in .NET Core framework, and we are home free. It's loaded. The set allows us to set data in that database, which you'll have to actually use today, because how are we going to get that data in there? Well, I could cheat and say, well, don't worry about the set method because the system actually never calls it. But you know me, I got to do some real implementation here. So we have our own implementation for set, where again, it's all standard, normal ADO.NET stuff. But for those of you faint of heart, look away. Open the database connection. Again, if it blows up, not my problem. That's whoever set this up, gave me the wrong database name. To whatever it is, that's your problem, right? Buyer beware. And then I insert, given the key in the value, I insert into the configuration and the section. How does it get the section? Right. The key, as you can see from the comments here, the key parameter is in the form section:value. The problem is that we override this method, so we can't change the signature. So what I've done is I make the assumption that your key comes in the form section:key, and then the value is the value. And so we will insert 3 different columns into our table for each record. And this ensure key format is correct method is returning to us the section and key name from the key argument. So it basically checks and makes sure everything is okay, and then it throws an exception. Again, not my problem, but I have to sort of parse it out anyway. So while I'm parsing it out, I am just making sure it's parsable correctly. So that's this method over here. It attempts to split it on the colon, and if its length is not 2, then it throws an exception. Otherwise, it just returns the first part and the second part back to you as the section name and the key name. It then adds the command parameters, the parameters to the command, if you will. That I should probably call this add command parameters to the query here. So these are 3 parameters we require. And so it adds these different parameters. And if you don't know what that means, that's fine. Let's change this name to add command parameters. Control dot. All right. Anyway, once that is done, we execute the query. The data, if everything is okay and there's no key violations, the data gets inserted into our database and we have a new record, right? So that's really what's going to happen there. If not, it's going to roll back the transaction. No matter what happens, it's going to dispose of the transaction and close off the connection. This is again standard ADO.NET stuff. The rest of the stuff is all helper methods, the adding the command parameters, parsing out the key from the section and the key. The load method is really the one that's going to get called, and the set method, right? That's it. So we have this configuration provider here that has implemented the load and the set, and I think we are good there. What are we missing? Yeah, we got to now implement in our source over here. Now that we have a configuration provider, what is this builder going to give us? Do we have any use for this builder? What is it going to give us? Add. I don't think we're going to add ourselves to this. I don't know about that. No, I don't think we need the builder. But we need to return our provider. So let's say return a new database configuration provider, and that needs the connection string keys that'll come from here. So we'll use this guy. All right, that wasn't too bad. Yeah, so even though we implemented these 2 classes, we did nothing really here. We just made sure that our connection string is forwarded to us by whoever calls this thing. We have access to it over here. We don't actually need the builder, I don't think. And we return our instance. So even our configuration provider will get the connection string, so you can do his connection business. Then whoever's going to call load calls that. That loads that up, and then whoever calls set. Well, nobody's going to call set, but we would have to use the set to initialize our database. Okay, so let's just move on to our database then. We need a table called configuration in a source. Well, the source is determined by the connection string. So I'll come up with my own name for the source here. So I'm going to add a new database. Let's call it configuration store. All right, that's a new database. Where did it go? Store. Okay, and then to this, we'll add a new table. So to our tables, we'll say new table. We're going to call this, what do you call it? Configuration. So the table name is configuration. The first column is section. So that's the column name. It's section, and it's for type varchar 50. Could be anything else. It's not nullable. The next is section key. It's also a varchar. Do you guys call it varchar or varchar? This is like my enum versus enum. So I say enum. Most Americans I know say enum, if you watch that video of mine. And I say varchar. And most Americans will say varchar. Varchar it is. I'm telling you seriously, that's the real way to pronounce it. Varchar. Okay. And then you see how I put the brackets here, the square brackets around here, because it's a reserved keyword in T-SQL. Okay, and then value, which is also reserved, I'm sure. No? Okay. Varchar 50 again. Maybe the value should be 100, you know, what if you put like a big old URL in there or something? Okay. So now we have these three columns. None of them are nullable, as in we required to give it all of those values. And now we need to make these two the combination of section, so app settings, blah. So the same blah could be found somewhere else, but not in app sections. That's how I'm seeing it. So the combination of section and key needs to be unique. So I'm going to set that as a primary key, which is unique. And where the heck is the table name gone? I don't know. Okay, there it is, table name. We're going to call it configuration. Configuration. Really? When did I do that? What? My configuration store, there's already a table called configuration? I don't believe so. How's that possible? Configuration store. These are my tables. I'm trying to create a table called configuration. And it says the table already exists. That is insane. Okay, then we'll call it configuration source. Configuration source. No, that's the database or store. Okay, so this is the source. This is the source of configuration. How's that? We'll have to change our query. Okay, now if I refresh it, we should see it over here. That's our table, that's our columns, and these two are primary keys, and all seems to be good. We need to change our code to include that query here to say configuration source. And the same goes for our insert. Right? Maybe there's a database called configuration in SQL, so I don't know what it is. Okay, it doesn't really matter since the connection string doesn't care to, this doesn't say anything about tables. It just talks about the databases and the database server and, you know, security and stuff like username, password, stuff like that. So it doesn't go deeper than the database itself. All right, so now let's add this. Let's see what it's going to take for us to add our new things, our source, this guy, to our code base. And I'll just close up some of the extra. Right. Okay. Before we do that, I'm going to show you what this application runs like. It's doing nothing but accessing the different information indirectly from our configuration provider. That is the one we built in the last project. But that's using the built-in .NET Core frameworks configuration provider, which is the add JSON file thing. And it's using that to display some of the data over here. So let's just see what that looks like when I run it. And hopefully it does run. Okay. And it looks like this. So essentially what we're seeing is these pieces of information that have really been extracted from, oops, that was too, anyway. So the table, the template, the source URL, the date, true, false, the database, and this is database connection stuff. This is nothing to do with our database connection. This is just what is there in the config file for that project. But we need a similar connection string. Cool. So the connection string is already there. Nice. So you can use that. What was this? 12 or 13? What was this? 13. I was just looking at the connection string. It says projects v12, but on the system I've got projects v13. So I can use the same connection string and just change it to v13. Okay, so that's how that works. So now if you were to change the source of data instead of coming from the app settings file, which is here, that's where it came from. But I'm just going to copy that source here, connection string. Okay. It's essentially displaying all these values in the console application, right? It's extracting the data from the app settings file and publishing that on the console. If we swapped out the source, the application is still behaving the same. It doesn't know any the better, like where the heck did this come from. It has no idea about that. And so what's going to happen is it should still see the same. Well, we might use the same data, but yeah, it'll show the same data, and the application isn't any the wiser. It just got swapped out. If all goes well, that is, if you're doing a good job here. Okay, so now let's modify our configuration. This is our configuration provider, my configuration provider. And to that, this add JSON, I want to not use this, right? So I don't want this configuration provider, but I want to use our own. Oops, what's it doing? Configuration builder.add. Okay, here it says give me a source, right? What's the other option? It's an action that also takes the config source. Okay, we can just do this. So if I were to give it a source, if I just say something like new database configuration source connection string, that would work. That's not the it's not as clean as like this guy here. If you see here, it just says add JSON file, and because that's an extension method. So let's just go build an extension method now. So what we need to do is we need to extend iConfiguration source. So we'll build an extension method. I know I don't like extension methods, but I'm gonna comply with the kind of what one would expect here. Okay. I'm not deciding by myself, but I'd be okay with this. It's just this connection string is going to get, about a year long, right? It's going to be like that big. It's just going to get unwieldy to see this large thing here. So, what is it? Now let me go paste that. There you go. Projects v13, configuration store, blah, blah, blah. Okay. This would work. Okay. It's not like it wouldn't. But let's go build our extension method for iConfiguration source, this guy here. All right. So we'll call it iConfiguration source extensions. Actually, it's iConfiguration builder. iConfiguration builder extensions. So configuration builder extensions, and in here, there you go. Okay, so we want to change the namespace. That's better. Okay, so it basically is all it's doing is doing the same thing we were doing there. Outside, it's just doing it inside, and it's making it a simple method called simpler looking add database provider, given and this is of course the extension method, so we can ignore this, and we just need to provide a connection string. It's pretty much doing the same thing. It's an extension method. Okay, it's not magic. All right, so back here now, instead of doing this, I'm going to leave the connection string here. So let me just do that first. Let me just take this out because it's going to honestly confuse us. So add, there you go, database provider. So add database provider, it takes a connection string, and we already have one of those, as you locked out there, and do that. And that's that. So that was as simple as swapping out the add JSON to say add database provider. But however, our table is totally empty. Well, how the heck are we going to get that data in there? So before we can actually test this application out, we need to make sure our data is in there, right? So we're going to take a look at this data in our app settings.json file. This data, it doesn't have to be the same, but I need to know all these key names, and we can put some values in there, and we need to insert that. Now you can do that manually in SSMS. You can go in here and you can say, to this table, you can say edit and you can start actually typing data in by hand. I'd rather just write a little program for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here. Before we do this part here, I need to make sure we have some data setup and what, right? And it's app settings. Turns out that the configuration system in .NET Core framework is case insensitive, luckily. So it doesn't really matter whether it's uppercase or lowercase or Pascal case in this case. So the data source is the same one as V13 is going to a database called Configuration Store, and it's integrated security, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So we're going to create our data source. We're going to call build on it. That's going to give us a provider. We could actually just as easily have just create the provider directly. That's all we really need here. We need to say new database, blah, blah, configuration provider, giving you the string, right? That. Let's just do that. Don't need the source to be used here. Okay, so we just in what's we complaining about? Dispose. Okay, yeah, it is disposable. Yep, it's a disposable. To dispose of it once we're done with that. Whenever we use. Why is it disposable, you ask? Well, because the code inside of that is using connections and such. And so it needs to be disposable. Dispose those things, the connections and whatever. So, okay. Dispose, everyone's happy? Cool. So what I'm doing is I'm using the set method that we had to implement to insert. Remember, we required our key to have this format with the colon, and then the value was the value, right? So I'm pretty much using the same values we had in our app settings.json file, sets that up, and we can kind of stop here, just make sure this works. Here it goes, guys. All right, it's come time to test to see if everything's going to work. So I'm going to hit F5. If all goes well, the system should break point here, stop, and woo, cool. So data's gone into our database. Let's check that out. So now if I were to come back here and select top rows. Whoa, look at that. So that's our section. That's the key. That's the data in case you're not able to see that. That's our data. Cool. Of course, if I run it again, it's going to blow out. You want to try that? You don't believe me? Okay, let's do it again. I'm going to stop. This time we're going to get a key violation exception. Again, bias data, bias problem. I'm not concerned with that kind of issue in my provider. So it says violation of primary key constraint, blah, 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 cannot insert duplicate key in object DBO, blah, blah, blah. The duplicate key value is app settings and email templates path. See? This has been terminated. Cool. So you can't do that twice. Well, if you did that, your problem. Okay, I'm just going to leave this here for now. Comment this out. So we don't need that. All right. So now that our data is there, we have we've sort of redirected our applications to using the JSON app settings JSON file is now using our database provider. And when this prints out this stuff here, it should still work. So now let's see if that works. Oops, didn't mean to do that. What is it saying? This is the first time we're accessing the load method, by the way. So let's see what it's saying there. The fiscal date time information. Oh, it doesn't like it. See? Did we insert the incorrect date? I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Yes, we did. Okay, I'm going to go fix it in the database here rather than write a whole nother, delete all these rows and do it again. So I'm going to say edit top 100 rows, and this value, of course, in the database is just a string. It doesn't want this to be a date time. So what date do we want? Let's put today's date, 11/17. So 11/17/2019. Right? That'll tell us that it's coming from where you are. You already know it's coming from the database. fact that we got an exception. All right. And so now let's run this again over here. So we should see today's date and there should be no exception, hopefully. Everything else is good. Let's check that out. Cool, stopped. And here we are. We have our data coming out of our database. There you see November 17th, blah, blah, blah. There you go. So this brings us to the end of this video. Now, as I said, we will look at the testability of the classes we wrote today and see what it will take for us to test. If you guys want to do that on your own, go ahead. This project and the source code for it, would it be this project? Yeah, I guess it'll be this project. And the source code for it will be on my GitHub, and there'll be a link for this below in the description. And I hope this was interesting and you've learned a few things on .NET Core and configuration systems in .NET Core and how to build your own custom configuration provider. Until next time.